In November 1877, 50 samurai in the ruined Shiroyama castle saw 3,000 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army deploying artillery and machine guns against them, and decided not to surrender. If this sounds familiar, it's because their grandfathers had done the same thing at the siege of Osaka Castle in 1615, where thousands of samurai fell under fire from modern rifles. The survivors back then had warned their sons, "Against bullets, steel armor is useless." Military treatises explained in detail that storming fortifications head-on was suicide. And yet here they were, a few dozen warriors ready to repeat every fatal mistake of their ancestors. Except this time, the force disparity was not 10-1, but 60-1. Every samurai at Shiroyama knew the history of Osaka Castle. It was the great trauma of their culture, the day the samurai code first clashed with the soulless efficiency of a mass army. They knew about their ancestors' blind loyalty to their lord. They knew about the futile assaults that littered the fields with bodies. They had grown up hearing how the flower of the samurai was cut down like grass by volleys of muskets. The lesson was crystal clear. Against a modern army, an honest fight meant death. And yet their leader, Saigo Takamori, looked at an almost identical tactical situation, and his battle plan was literally, stand to the end. It was as if the samurai class had collectively decided that dying the same way their ancestors did was somehow honorable. The siege at Shiroyama Castle should never have happened. The Satsuma Rebellion, which Saigo Takamori had raised in February 1877, began with 20,000 loyal samurai. But after months of fighting, disease, and desertion, by September he had maybe 500 men left. His great campaign to restore samurai honor had turned into a death march. Men were dying of hunger and wounds every night. This was supposed to be Takamori's great military adventure, but it turned into the death throes of an entire social class. Saigo's army was dying on its feet before the final battle even began. They had been retreating for weeks through hostile territory, suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion. Most hadn't eaten properly in days. Chroniclers describe samurai with bandages made of dirty cloth, too weak to carry their weapons. Many were barefoot, their straw sandals having rotted in the autumn rains. The samurai were skeletons, barely able to hold their katanas. Some were so exhausted they were vomiting while forming defensive lines. The imperial soldiers, fresh and well-fed, looked at these walking dead and laughed. When the Imperial Army finally cornered Saigo on Mount Shiroyama on September 24th, they couldn't believe their luck. Japanese scouts reported the enemy force was no more than 500 fighters. The Imperial troops had spent weeks assembling this army, drawing regiments from all over southern Japan. And now they had cornered the samurai like rats. Imperial officers celebrated on the eve of battle, getting drunk on sake, betting on who would capture which samurai commander. Some discussed the cages they would keep prisoners in during ransom negotiations. General Yamagata had to threaten his own officers with punishment to stop them from attacking that night. They were that confident of an easy victory. The night before the battle, the samurai camp was as quiet as a graveyard. The men were too sick and scared to talk. Some wrote letters to families they knew they would never see again. Others confessed their sins to monks moving through the camp. Saigo ordered complete silence. Anyone who made noise would be punished because he didn't want the enemy to know how close they were to collapse. The samurai could hear the imperial soldiers celebrating on the opposite side, could see their campfires, could hear them singing and laughing. Some of the younger samurai tried to desert during the night, crawling into the woods, but imperial patrols caught and killed them. By dawn, the samurai were trapped, outnumbered at least 60-1 in a foreign province with no hope of reinforcement. The only question was whether they would die fighting or die running. The battlefield at Shiroyama was even worse for the samurai than Osaka Castle had been for their ancestors. Shiroyama wasn't a real castle, but merely a mountain ridge with remnants of old fortifications. The slopes were steep, overgrown with dense forest, making any maneuvers difficult. It was essentially a natural fortress, but also a deadly trap. There was nowhere to retreat. The samurai positioned themselves on a narrow crest, their archers and marksmen on the flanks, protected by makeshift barricades of stones and felled trees. The Imperials would have to funnel into this killing zone, compressed together, unable to maneuver, walking straight into the line of fire. The samurai used the terrain with a wisdom their ancestors lacked. They dug shallow trenches, created firing positions with cover, and cleared fields of fire. This was a new tactic, adapted since the time of Osaka. The Imperial Army would have to funnel onto this narrow path, compressed together, unable to deploy, walking straight into fire. It was such an obvious trap that some junior Imperial officers argued they should wait, starve the samurai out, or find another way. They were shouted down by commanders who thought honor demanded an immediate attack. On the morning of September 24th, Imperial commanders held a war council that somehow managed to ignore every lesson from Japanese military history. General Yamagata, one of the few officers who understood modern warfare, proposed a sensible plan. Use artillery to destroy the fortifications, surround the samurai positions through the woods, wait for the defenders to exhaust their ammunition, then attack with fresh troops. He was ridiculed by officers who called him a coward. Colonel Tanaka declared it would be dishonorable to let rebels dictate the terms of battle. Lieutenant General Oyama, trying to compromise, suggested they at least deploy their riflemen in a dispersed formation. He was told this showed insufficient faith in Japanese courage. The final plan was essentially, go at them until we win. The Imperial Army had superior artillery, modern mountain guns that their crews begged to use to destroy the samurai fortifications. Artillery officers pleaded to be allowed to soften up the samurai positions before the assault. The Imperial command refused, calling it dishonorable, to let cannons decide the battle before the infantry could prove its valor. The artillerymen were literally pushed to the back. Some Imperial officers even drew swords against their own artillerymen who tried to move forward. The same class pride that had doomed their ancestors at Osaka was about to doom them again. The Imperial Army's final plan was simple, elegant, and absolutely suicidal. They arranged their 3,000 soldiers in 3 lines and ordered them to assault the height head-on. The first line was to wear down the defenders, the second to finish them off, the third to mop up the remnants. They had created perfect conditions for a slaughter, where their own numbers worked against them, bunching soldiers up on narrow paths under murderous fire from above. When the battle commenced on the morning of September 24th, the samurai looked like an army of the damned. Many fought without armor, they simply had none. Some were barefoot. The Imperial soldiers in their modern uniforms, armed with Murata rifles, must have thought they were facing crazed fanatics, not soldiers. But these dying men had one advantage. They knew they could not retreat. They were too weak, too far from home. They would win or die where they stood. The first Imperial attack began at 6 a.m. and immediately turned into a nightmare. The soldiers carrying full gear had to climb the steep slope through thick brush. Each step required enormous effort. Within 50 meters they were exhausted. Within 100 they were gasping for breath. Neat lines dissolved as faster soldiers outpaced slower ones. Some fell face down and couldn't get up, and they hadn't even reached effective firing range yet. The samurai watched this slow-moving disaster approach and couldn't believe their luck. At 100 meters they began their work. Just like at Osaka, dozens of arrows and bullets showered the advancing troops. But this time, the Imperial soldiers couldn't even advance quickly up the slope. The terrain held them in place like targets on a shooting range. Bullets found every gap in the formation. Soldiers in the front ranks fell with gunshot wounds and couldn't get up. Their comrades stepped on them, pushing them further down the slope. The samurai, despite their exhaustion and hunger, fired with mechanical precision. Their Enfield rifles, though outdated, were deadly in the hands of experienced marksmen. With 50 marksmen making up to 10 shots per minute, that meant 500 bullets per minute falling on Imperial soldiers who were barely moving forward. The Imperial first line kept advancing through the hail of bullets because stopping meant certain death and advancing meant possible glory. When the Imperial soldiers finally reached the samurai positions, the narrow strip of the ridge created a catastrophe. 1,000 men of the first line were squeezed into a front, maybe 200 meters wide. Men were pressed so tightly they couldn't raise their weapons. The flanks, trying to avoid the fire, pushed toward the center. Soldiers were literally crushing each other to death before they even reached the samurai lines. The compression in the Imperial ranks became so extreme that men began dying without being struck. Soldiers in the middle of the crush couldn't move their arms, couldn't fall down, couldn't even breathe properly. They stood upright, held in place by the bodies around them, slowly suffocating while others pushed from behind. Some suffered pressure injuries, broken ribs, collapsed lungs. Men were dying standing up, dead on their feet, but unable to fall. When the pressure finally released, dozens of soldiers would collapse at once, revealing they had been dead for minutes.
When the Imperial soldiers finally engaged in hand-to-hand combat, they were so exhausted from the climb and so compressed together that they could barely fight. The samurai, fresh and on prepared ground, simply had to thrust katanas and spears into the mass of bodies pressed against them. It was less of a battle than an industrial slaughter, exactly like Osaka, but somehow even more pathetic.
In the midst of this disaster, Saigo Takamori, one of Japan's greatest samurai, fought his way through the heart of the chaos. With a handful of loyal warriors, he cut through the Imperial soldiers, driven by the insane courage that the samurai class mistook for tactics. He actually reached the line of Imperial officers, coming within centimeters of changing the battle's outcome. For a moment, it seemed the samurai might snatch victory from catastrophe through sheer individual heroism. Then Imperial soldiers swarmed Takamori, knocked him down, and shot him with rifles. He died, committing seppuku, the last samurai who could have changed the battle's outcome. After Takamori's death, the remaining samurai carried out what became known as their last deadly charge. About 40 men stood up and rushed down the slope straight into the main forces of the Imperial Army. This was not an attempt to break through. It was an act of collective suicide, the final affirmation of their code. They knew they would die, but preferred death to capture. The Imperial soldiers, shocked by this attack, initially fell back. The sight of dozens of warriors rushing to certain death was so shocking it caused confusion in the ranks. For a few minutes, the samurai, fewer than 50 strong, pushed back 3,000 soldiers. It was pure psychological shock, a demonstration that could be stronger than numbers. The last samurai fell within an hour of their final charge. They died almost to the last man. Of the original 500 defenders of Shiroyama, fewer than 40 survived, all severely wounded. Imperial losses were horrifying. Over 800 killed and wounded against a handful of defenders. It was a loss ratio of 16-1 in the samurai's favor. When the killing finally stopped around noon, the battlefield looked like a vision of hell. The bodies of Imperial soldiers were piled so high in some places that they blocked the view across the slope. Japanese officers counted between 500 and 800 Imperial dead, including many promising young officers. The samurai had lost almost everyone. The entire military aristocracy of Japan lay dead on the hillside. Shiroyama became more than just a battle. It was the end of the 700-year era of samurai dominance in Japan. With the death of Takamori and his followers, the last organized force opposing modernization disappeared. That day on the hillside, it wasn't just a man who died. An entire way of life died. The worst part of Shiroyama wasn't the death toll or the tactical disaster. It was the fact that the Imperial command had every opportunity to avoid it and chose brute force over tactics. They had overwhelming numerical superiority, better equipment, fresh troops against dying enemies. All they had to do was nothing. Surround the samurai, let starvation finish its work. Instead, They charged into the same trap their ancestors had died in, made the same mistakes, ignored the same advice, and died on the same slope. It proved that Japanese military culture valued personal honor over victory, individual glory over collective success, and a beautiful death over an intelligent victory. And incredibly, the imperial officers still hadn't learned their lesson. They would continue to fight battles the same way for another 70 years until the atomic bombings finally taught them that technology and tactics could actually win wars if you let them fight smartly instead of making people die beautifully. The greatest irony of Shiroyama was that the samurai lost the battle but won the war for memory. Saigo Takamori, a rebel and enemy of the state, was posthumously pardoned and became a national hero. His statue stands in Tokyo today, while the names of the generals who defeated him are largely forgotten. They achieved a military victory, but lost the battle for history. Shiroyama proved that when two eras collide, the one that wins is not the one with more honor, but the one that adapts better. The samurai chose a beautiful death over an ugly victory, and disappeared. Their tragedy serves as an eternal reminder. Tradition incapable of evolution is simply disguised suicide. And amazingly, we still haven't learned this lesson, continuing in a million small ways to choose beautiful principles over effective solutions, dooming ourselves to repeat Shiroyama again and again.